The cardboard box smelled like old paper and disappointment. Dan Rivers pulled out another stack of water-damaged cookbooks from the 1950s and added them to the pile of things nobody would ever want. Estate sales always felt like this, picking through the abandoned pieces of someone's life, looking for the one thing that mattered. The farmhouse outside Portland had belonged to a woman named Dorothy Marsh, who died at 93 with no living relatives. Her belongings were spread across tables in the front yard, tagged with prices that seemed almost apologetic. Dan had driven 2 hours for this, hoping to find something interesting for his collection of historical oddities. So far, he had found 3 broken clocks and a stuffed owl with one eye missing that he was about to leave when he noticed a wooden crate pushed under the dessert table. The seller, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, saw him looking. "That was her grandfather's stuff," she said. "He did archaeology back in the 20s, before they had rules about what you could take. Most of it is just rocks." Dan knelt and opened the crate. Inside were indeed rocks, or things that looked like rocks. Pottery shards wrapped in newspaper from 1927. A few arrowheads. Some chunks of what might have been ancient concrete. And then, at the bottom, something different. The tablet was roughly the size of a dinner plate, made from dark stone that seemed to drink in the light around it. Symbols covered its surface, carved deep and filled with what looked like dried clay, or maybe old paint. Dan picked it up and nearly dropped it. The stone was warm, almost hot, like it had been sitting in direct sunlight. "How much for this?" he asked. The woman barely glanced at it. $20. Take the whole crate if you want. I need to clear this out by tonight." Dan paid her and carried the crate to his truck. He told himself it was probably nothing, just another piece of tourist junk from some gift shop in Egypt or Peru. But the warmth coming through the cardboard made him think otherwise. Back at his apartment, Dan cleared space on his desk and set the tablet under his reading lamp. The symbols were like nothing he had seen before, and he had spent years cataloging ancient languages for the university library. They were not Egyptian, not Sumerian, not any of the Asian scripts he recognized. The stone itself was perfectly smooth except for the carvings, worked with a precision that seemed impossible for primitive tools. He took photographs, planning to send them to some colleagues who knew more about this sort of thing. Then he made dinner, watched half a movie, and went to bed, leaving the tablet on his desk. T3 in the morning, he woke to his name being whispered. Dan sat up in bed, heart racing. The apartment was dark and silent. He was alone. He had to be alone. He lived alone, and the door was locked, and there was no one else here. Done? It came from the living room. Soft, like wind through leaves, but clear enough to understand. He grabbed his phone, turned on a flashlight, and walked slowly toward his desk. The tablet was glowing. Not bright, just a soft amber light that pulsed like breathing. The symbols were moving, shifting positions on the stone's surface like insects crawling over each other. Dan watched them rearrange themselves into patterns that made his eyes hurt. Then they stopped moving and formed words he could read. Finally, the bondkeeper returns. Dan's hand shook as he held the phone light steady. The words were in English, written in the same carved style as the original symbols, as if they had always been there. "Who are you?" he said to the empty room, feeling insane. The symbols shifted again. "Asherah, last of the flame wing. I have waited so long." "This is not happening," Dan said. "I am asleep, or I hit my head, or someone put something in my food. You are awake. You are well. You are the first to touch this stone with intention in 3,000 years. Dan sat down hard in his desk chair. The rational part of his mind insisted this had to be a trick, some kind of technology he did not understand, maybe a prank by students who knew about his hobby. But the stone was warm under his fingers when he touched it, warm like living skin, and the glow brightened at his contact. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "To remember," the words said. "Humanity forgot us. Forgot the partnership. Forgot what you promised when the world was young and the rifts threatened to tear everything apart. I don't know what you're talking about. You will. Sleep now, Dan Rivers. We have much to discuss when the sun rises. I have been alone in the dark for so very long. It is good to speak again. It is good to know someone hears me." The glow faded slowly, like embers dying in a fireplace. The symbols returned to their original meaningless patterns. Dan sat at his desk until dawn, staring at the tablet, waiting for it to speak again. It did not. But when he finally touched it, just before the sun came up, he felt something he could not explain. A presence, ancient and patient and desperately, achingly lonely. Something that had been waiting in silence for longer than he could imagine, hoping that someone, anyone, would remember it existed. Dan did not go to work that day. He called in sick and sat with the tablet and waited for Ashera to speak again. 3 days passed before Dan truly believed he was not losing his mind. 3 days of the stone tablet speaking to him in words that formed and dissolved across its surface. 3 days of voice that sounded like fire crackling, like wind over mountains, like something that should not exist but did. Ashera was patient with his disbelief. She answered his questions, let him test the tablet with every tool he owned, allowed him to take it to a geologist friend who confirmed the stone was real and old and completely impossible to date with any accuracy. The friend found no trace of electronics, no projection system, nothing that explained the glowing symbols. You are a librarian, Ashera said on the 4th morning, her words appearing while Dan ate breakfast at his desk. You understand that history can be forgotten. That knowledge can be lost. Yes, Dan said, spreading peanut butter on toast. He had started talking to a stone tablet like it was normal. That probably meant something bad about his mental health. Then understand this. 10,000 years ago, your world was not alone. Rifts opened between dimensions, thin places where reality tore and bled. Things came through. Hungry things, lost things, things that fed on fear and confusion, that made madness spread like disease. Dan stopped chewing. The symbols glowed brighter as Ashera continued. My kind, the dragons, lived in the spaces between worlds. We could see the rifts forming, could move through dimensional boundaries. We came to Earth to help seal them, but we cannot do it alone. Sealing a rift requires an anchor, something that exists firmly in one reality, rooted and unmovable. And you needed humans for that. Not just needed, chose. We approached many species across many worlds, offering partnership. Most refused. Those who accepted did so for power, for knowledge, for what they could gain. Only humans were different. Dan set down his toast. Different how? The symbols rearranged slowly, as if Ashera was choosing her words with care. You form bonds. True bonds. Not alliances based on mutual benefit, but connections that defy logic. You love things that cannot love you back. You protect creatures weaker than yourselves with no expectation of reward. You grieve for strangers. You hope when hoping is foolish. That sounds like you're calling us stupid. I'm calling you unique. That emotional capacity, that illogical compassion, creates a resonance, a frequency in your neural patterns that, when combined with dragon essence, can stabilize dimensional barriers. Your empathy is a power, Dan Rivers. Perhaps the greatest power in any universe we have encountered. Dan rubbed his eyes. This was too much. Yesterday, he had been a librarian who collected odd antiques. Today, he was apparently some kind of dimensional anchor for an ancient dragon. So what happened? If we had this partnership, where did all the dragons go? We sealed the rifts. It took centuries, but we succeeded. Most of my kind returned to our realm between dimensions. A few chose to stay, bonded so deeply with their human partners that separation seemed impossible. But humans are brief, Dan. You live and die in what feels like moments to us. Our partners aged and passed, and we had no way to find new ones. The knowledge of our existence faded. We became myths, then legends, then forgotten entirely. Except you stayed. Some of us created sanctuaries. These artifacts, we poured our consciousness into stone and metal and crystal, waiting, hoping that someday someone would remember, that the need would arise again. Dan touched the tablet's warm surface. The need. You mean the rifts are opening again? Yes. Slowly at first, small tears that seal themselves. But they are growing larger, more frequent. Without guardians, without bond keepers, your world is vulnerable. I have been aware of this for decades, trapped in stone, unable to act, unable to warn anyone. Then you touched me with intention, with curiosity and care, and the bond formed. Weak, still, new, but real. I don't know how to seal rifts. I organize books and sometimes teach library science to undergraduates. You will learn. More importantly, you already possess what matters most. I have touched your mind, Dan. I know your heart. You are kind. You are stubborn. You protect things you love, even when protection seems impossible. These qualities are not weaknesses. They are weapons against chaos. Dan stood and paced his small apartment. Outside, traffic moved through Portland streets. People went to work, bought groceries, lived normal lives. None of them knew that reality itself was tearing at the seams. Are there others? He asked. Other dragons and artifacts? Yes, scattered across your world. Hidden in museums and private collections, buried in ruins, lost in attics and basements. Each of us waiting, each hoping to be found before it is too late. And if I refuse? If I just put you back in that crate and pretend this never happened? The symbols pulsed, and for the first time, Dan felt emotion through the stone. Not anger, but sadness. Deep and old and terrible. Then I wait alone in the dark again, and the rifts continue opening. And eventually something comes through that your people cannot explain away, cannot rationalize, cannot survive. I will not force you, Dan Rivers. The bond only works when freely given. Dragons learned that lesson long ago. Dan looked at the tablet, at this impossible thing that had entered his life and turned it upside down. He thought about walking away, going back to his quiet existence among books and students and predictable routines. He thought about all the people who would never know they were in danger, who would never understand what was coming. He thought about something ancient and powerful choosing to wait alone for thousands of years, hoping someone would care enough to listen. Okay, he said quietly. Teach me. Show me what I need to do. The tablet glowed warm and bright, and Dan felt something settle into place inside his chest. A connection, a purpose, a partnership between human and dragon, renewed after millennia of silence. Outside his window, reality flickered just slightly, a ripple across the morning sky that no one else seemed to notice. The university library closed at midnight, but Dan had keys and a reason to be there that no one would question. He sat in the archives surrounded by books, so old they needed special handling, cross-referencing texts from civilizations that barely overlapped in time or geography. The patterns were there once he knew to look for them. References to winged protectors in Sumerian clay tablets. Chinese legends of lung dragons who guarded against demons from beyond the world. Aztec codices describing feathered serpents who sealed cracks in the sky. Aboriginal Australian stories of rainbow serpents who mended the dream time when it tore. Every culture had dragon myths. Every single one. Dan had always assumed it was coincidence, the human mind creating similar archetypes independently. Now he understood it was memory, degraded over millennia, but persistent. Humanity remembered its guardians, even if the details had become confused. You are learning, Ashera said. The tablet sat on the desk beside him, her words forming in soft amber light. I'm finding stories, Dan corrected. That's not the same as proof. Look deeper. Your modern governments know things they do not share. Dan pulled up his laptop and started searching classified document repositories. Working at a university library meant he had access to some academic databases that scraped declassified government files. He filtered for unexplained phenomena, dimensional anomalies, reality distortions. The results made his hands go cold. Reports from the last 5 years showed a sharp increase in what officials called localized causality violations. Time loops lasting seconds. Objects appearing without origin. Witness accounts of creatures that could not exist, always dismissed as mass hallucination or gas leaks or weather phenomena. One report from 6 months ago described an incident in rural Montana where 17 people reported seeing the sky crack like glass. The official explanation involved rare atmospheric ice crystals and shared psychological stress. But the attached field report, partially redacted, mentioned burn marks and patterns that matched no known combustion source and residual energy readings that made no sense. This was a rift, Dan said, showing the report to the tablet. Yes, a small one that sealed itself, but it remained open for nearly an hour. Something came through, though your authorities will not admit what. They found it and contained it. What was it? A scavenger from a dead dimension. Harmless in small amounts, but frightening to those who do not understand. Your governments have been collecting such creatures for decades, studying them in secret, trying to comprehend forces they have no framework to grasp. Dan continued searching and found more. So much more. Patterns of strangeness increasing year over year. The rifts were opening with greater frequency, and no one in power knew how to stop them because no one remembered that stopping them was even possible. That he found academic papers too, buried in obscure journals. A physicist in Germany theorizing about membrane boundaries between dimensions. A mathematician in Japan describing equations that predicted reality could tear under certain conditions. A psychologist in Canada documenting mass sightings of impossible things, noting that emotional stress seemed to correlate with occurrence rates. None of them knew they were describing the same phenomenon. None of them had the full picture, but together, their research painted a clear image of a world approaching crisis. I need to see one, Dan said. A rift. I need to understand what we're dealing with. You will, Ashera replied. Sooner than you wish. I can feel one forming now, perhaps 2 days away. The bond between us is growing stronger. It allows me to sense disturbances across greater distances. Where? Close. Within your city. Dan spent the next day learning what Ashera could teach him. She showed him how to perceive the world differently, how to quiet his mind and feel for the thin places where reality wore through. It was like learning to see a new color, to hear a frequency that had always existed but went unnoticed. The world took on layers, depth beyond simple three-dimensional space, that he started noticing the weak points. A corner behind the grocery store where space felt too tight, compressed. A park bench that seemed to exist slightly out of phase with its surroundings. A bus stop where the air shimmered wrong. These are healing rifts, Ashera explained. Old tears that sealed but left scars. They will not reopen unless stressed, but they show you what to look for. By evening, Dan could feel it too. Something building, a pressure against reality, like water pushing against a dam. It centered somewhere north, toward the river, that he tried to sleep, but could not. At 2 a.m, he gave up and got dressed, putting the tablet in his backpack. If this was happening, if a rift was really opening, he needed to be there. Needed to see it. Needed to know this was all real and not some elaborate delusion. The pressure led him through empty streets to the waterfront, to an abandoned warehouse district scheduled for demolition. Chain-link fences surrounded the buildings, but Dan found a gap and slipped through. The tablet grew hot against his back, Ashara's presence intensifying. It comes, she said, her words burning bright enough to see through the fabric of the backpack. Be ready, Dan Rivers. What you are about to witness cannot be unseen. The air between 2 warehouses began to ripple, then crack, then tear like fabric, revealing nothing behind it. Not darkness, not light, but nothing. Absence. A hole in existence that Dan's mind could not properly process. Things moved in that nothing. Shapes without form, hunger without body. One began to push through, a writhing mass of shadow that made Dan's eyes water and his stomach turn. What do I do? He asked, backing away. Stand firm, Ashera commanded. Trust the bond. Trust yourself. You carry more strength than you know. The shadow thing pulled itself further into reality, taking shape as it fed on the fear Dan could not help but feel. It grew legs, eyes, a mouth full of angles that should not exist. Dan wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to run. But he thought about Ashera waiting 3,000 years in darkness. He thought about all the people sleeping in their homes who had no idea what was coming through that tear in the world. He thought about being human, about being stupid enough to hope, illogical enough to care, stubborn enough to protect things he loved even when protection seemed impossible. Dan Rivers stood his ground, and inside his backpack, the dragon tablet blazed like the sun. The shadow creature fully emerged from the rift, standing nearly 8 feet tall on legs that bent wrong at too many joints. It had no face Dan could recognize, just a void where features should be, and that void was watching him. He could feel its attention like ice water down his spine. Ashera, I don't know what to do. Dan pulled the tablet from his backpack, gripping it so hard his knuckles went white. You anchor me. Her voice came not from the stone now, but from everywhere, from the air itself. Your presence in this reality, your determination to protect it, gives me form. But you must not run. You must not give in to fear. The bond requires courage, Dan. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. The creature took a step toward him, moving in a way that hurt to watch, like it existed in more dimensions than Dan could perceive. Behind it, the rift pulsed, and he could see more shapes moving in that terrible nothing, waiting to come through. Dan forced himself to breathe. His hands shook, but he kept his feet planted. Okay, I'm here. I'm not running. Now what? Now you let me come home. Light erupted from the tablet, so bright Dan had to close his eyes. He felt heat, not burning but alive, rushing through his arms and into his chest. The bond that had been a thin thread between them suddenly blazed into a cable of pure energy. Through it, Dan felt what Ashera felt, saw what she saw, understood what she was: ancient, powerful, patient, and so deeply, achingly grateful to exist in the physical world again after an eternity of imprisonment. Dan opened his eyes and saw her. A dragon made of living flame and thought, translucent and solid at the same time, coiled between him and the creature. She was smaller than he expected, no larger than a horse, but the power radiating from her made the air shimmer with heat. I am Ashera, last of the flame wing, she said, and her voice was thunder and music and the crackling of a warm fire all at once. This world is under my protection. You do not belong here. The shadow creature recoiled, shrieking in a frequency that made Dan's teeth ache. It lunged at Ashera with limbs that split into too many claws, each one trailing darkness that seemed to eat the light around it. Ashera met it head-on. She moved like liquid fire, faster than Dan's eyes could follow, wrapping around the creature and burning. But it was not normal fire. It was something else, something that attacked the creature's very existence, unmaking the wrongness of its presence in this dimension. Dan felt the strain through their bond. Ashera was strong, but she had been dormant for so long, and manifesting even partially drained her. The creature fought back, tearing at her essence with those impossible claws, and each wound sent pain echoing through the connection between them. Done? Ashera's voice was strained. The rift. I cannot fight and seal at the same time. He looked at the tear in reality, still pulsing, still open. More shapes pressed against it from the other side. How do I seal it? Move to the threshold. Let yourself feel the wrongness of it, the way it violates everything that should be. Your emotional response, your rejection of it, feeds the bond. Use that. Dan ran toward the rift, every instinct screaming that this was insane. The closer he got, the worse it felt. Wrong, 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 like nails on a chalkboard, made physical, like watching something beautiful be destroyed. The wrongness filled him with rage, with desperate need to make it stop. He thought about his city, sleeping peacefully just miles away. He thought about everyone going about their lives, never knowing how close they were to things that could destroy them. He thought about being human, about that stupid, illogical compassion Ashera claimed was their greatest power. Dan reached out and pressed his hands against the edges of the rift that IT felt like touching ice and fire at the same time, like every nerve in his body screaming in protest. But through the bond, he felt Ashera's strength flowing into him, her essence mixing with his human determination. The rift resisted, pulsing, trying to widen. Dan pushed back. Close, he said through clenched teeth. You don't belong here. This world is protected. This world is loved. Close. Behind him, Ashera roared. The shadow creature came apart under her assault, dissolving into nothing, unmade by dragon fire that burned away its dimensional anchor. Freed from combat, she turned her full attention to the rift, adding her power to Dan's will. Together, they pulled. Reality bent, stretched, then snapped back into place. The rift sealed with a sound like a thunderclap, and Dan was thrown backward, landing hard on the concrete. His hands were smoking but unburned, and every muscle in his body felt like it had run a marathon. Ashera hovered above him, her form flickering now, less solid. "Well done, Bondkeeper. Your first seal. It will not be your last." "That was horrible," Dan gasped. "Please tell me it gets easier." "It does not, but you'll get stronger. We will get stronger together." The dragon began to fade, her essence flowing back into the tablet, which lay beside Dan on the ground. Within seconds, she was gone, leaving only the warm stone and the memory of her presence. Dan lay there for a long time, staring at the sky, watching the stars that seemed brighter now, more real. The place where the rift had been was just empty air now, indistinguishable from any other space between buildings. In a few hours, workers would arrive for the demolition, never knowing what had happened here. His phone buzzed. A news alert about strange lights reported in the warehouse district, already being explained as electrical transformers exploding. The official story was already being written, tucking the impossible neatly away where it would not disturb anyone's sleep. But Dan knew the truth now. Knew what was coming. Knew that somewhere out there, other rifts were forming, other creatures were trying to push through. And there were not enough guardians to stop them all. He picked up the tablet and pressed it against his chest, feeling Ashara's presence inside, resting but aware. "You said there were others," he said quietly. "Other dragons and artifacts. We need to find them. We need to wake them up." "Yes," Ashara replied, her words appearing faintly on the stone surface. "But finding them is only the beginning. They will need bondkeepers, and not every human can form a connection. We must search for both the artifacts and the people strong enough to anchor us." Dan stood on shaking legs and started walking home. Somewhere across the world, an artifact sat forgotten in a museum display. Somewhere else, one gathered dust in a private collection. And somewhere, people were going about their lives, having no idea they carried the potential to become guardians. Dan had been one of those people just a week ago. Now he was something else, something the world needed, whether it knew that or not. The hunt was about to begin. Finding the first artifact took Dan 3 weeks and a credit card bill he could barely afford. Ashera could sense other dragons across great distances now that their bond had strengthened, but she could only give him directions, not exact locations. The pull led him to Tokyo, to a small museum in a neighborhood most tourists never visited. The pottery shard sat in a display case labeled as fragments from the Jomon period, 12,000 years old. It looked like broken cookware, unimpressive brown clay with simple markings. But when Dan pressed his hand against the glass, he felt warmth, and the markings began to glow faintly. He bought a ticket, waited until closing time, and convinced the tired security guard he had left his phone in the bathroom. 2 minutes alone in the exhibit room was all he needed. He touched the shard properly, skin to clay, and felt the presence wake. "Who calls?" The voice was different from Ashara's, higher and sharper, like wind through canyon walls. "A friend," Dan said quickly. "Another bondkeeper. We're trying to find all of you. I am Kira, Sky Voice of the Third Flight." "How long has it been?" "A long time. Too long. But we need you now. The rifts are opening again." He felt the dragon's awareness expand, stretching across the city, sensing the weak points in reality. "Yes, I feel them. So many. Why did no one wake us sooner?" "Because everyone forgot you existed. But that's changing. I'll find you a bondkeeper, someone who can give you form. Can you wait a little longer?" "I have waited ages. I can wait days more." Dan left the museum and started making calls. He had been building a list based on Ashara's guidance, looking for people with the right qualities. Compassionate but strong. Protective but not aggressive. People who formed deep connections easily, who would sacrifice for others without thinking about cost. He found her working at a fire station. Lee Sun-mi was 32, had pulled 14 people from burning buildings in her career, and fostered rescue dogs in her spare time. When Dan showed her the shard and explained what he needed, she thought he was insane. Then Kira spoke directly into her mind, and Sunmi's eyes went wide. "This is real," she whispered. "This is real," Dan confirmed. Sunmi bonded with Kira within an hour, the connection forming so naturally it seemed inevitable. When the dragon manifested for the first time, taking the shape of a serpent made of silver light and storm clouds, Sunmi laughed with pure joy. Dan found the next artifact in London, a carved gemstone in an antique shop near the British Museum. The dragon inside called himself Forge, deep-voiced and patient. His bondkeeper turned out to be a teacher named Peter Walsh, who worked with special needs children and had more patience than anyone Dan had ever met. Buenos Aires yielded a metallic scale hidden in a flea market containing a dragon named River who bonded with a marine biologist. Cairo gave him a small statue that held Storm, who found her bondkeeper in a doctor working with refugees. Each awakening was different. Some dragons were cheerful, grateful for any contact after their long sleep. Others were bitter, angry at being forgotten, slow to trust. Some humans accepted the bond immediately. Others needed time, needed proof, needed to see a rift firsthand before they truly believed, but they came together. Slowly, carefully, a network of guardians began forming across the world. They shared information through encrypted channels, warned each other when rifts opened, traveled to help seal breaches that were too large for one pair alone. Dan coordinated from Portland, which seemed to have become a nexus for rift activity. Asherah thought it had something to do with the city's location, built on a convergence of ley lines, or magnetic anomalies, or something else the dragons did not fully understand either. Whatever the reason, rifts opened there frequently, and Dan and Asherah had become very good at sealing them. 6 months after finding that first artifact at the estate sale, Dan gathered with 5 other bondkeepers in a rented warehouse space. They had come from 3 continents, leaving behind jobs and families and normal lives to attend this meeting. Sunmi stood beside him, Kira's presence a constant shimmer in the air around her. Peter had arrived from London yesterday. The others were still introducing themselves, still learning that they were not alone in this strange new reality. "We're not enough," Dan said, looking at the group. "There are 7 of us, 7 pairs, and rifts are opening faster every month. We're sealing them as fast as we can, but we're going to miss one eventually. Something's going to get through that we can't stop. So we find more artifacts," Sunmi said. "Wake more dragons. We found most of the ones Asherah can sense. There might be others, but they're either too far away or too deeply hidden. We need a different approach." Peter spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "We need to understand why this is happening. The dragons sealed the rifts before. What's changed? Why are they opening again now?" It was Forge who answered, the dragon's presence manifesting partially in the center of their circle. "The seals were always temporary. We bought humanity time, millennia of peace, but we always knew the rifts would return. The universe tends toward entropy. Order breaks down. Barriers weaken. So this just gets worse forever?" someone asked. "We just keep fighting until we can't anymore." "Not necessarily," Asherah said, appearing beside Forge. "The original seals were performed by hundreds of dragon-human pairs working in concert. A great ritual that bound the dimensions apart. We are too few to repeat that working, but perhaps we can create something smaller. Something local. A network," Dan said, understanding. "Instead of one big seal, lots of small ones. Each pair maintaining their region, strengthening the barriers gradually. It would take years," Forge rumbled. "Decades perhaps. And it would require more bond keepers than we have. Then we train people," Sunmi said. "We find those with the potential, and we teach them. We make this knowledge common again instead of hidden." The dragons conferred silently among themselves, their essences flickering and intertwining. Finally, Asherah spoke. "It is dangerous. If the wrong people learn of us, learn what we can do, they will seek to use us as weapons. Governments, militaries, those who see power as something to control rather than protect. We were forgotten partially by accident, but also by design. After the rift sealed, some of us chose to hide because we saw how humans turned every tool into a weapon eventually. We're not asking you to trust all of humanity, Dan said. Just us. Just the people we choose carefully. The ones who understand that protecting something means serving it, not owning it. The dragons were silent for a long moment. Then one by one they agreed. The risk was necessary. The alternative was worse. That night, Dan stood on the warehouse roof with Asherah manifested beside him, watching the city lights spread below. Somewhere out there, another rift was forming. He could feel it building, maybe 2 days away. He would seal it with Asherah's help. They always did, but now they were not alone in the fight. Now, there were others who understood, who could help carry the weight of protecting a world that did not know it needed protection. We're going to save them, Dan said quietly. All of them, even if they never know we did it. Asherah's flame-bright eyes turned toward him. That is the most human thing you have ever said. The warnings came simultaneously from 7 dragons across 4 continents. Something massive was forming over the Pacific Ocean, a rift larger than anything they had encountered. Asherah felt it first, waking Dan from sleep with urgency that made his heart race before he was fully conscious. Gather everyone, she said. This one will require all of us. Within 18 hours, every bondkeeper they had found converged on a research vessel Dan had chartered under a false organization name. They stood on deck under gray skies, watching the horizon where the rift would appear. The dragons manifested around them, 7 brilliant forms of fire and light and storm, hovering protectively over their humans. How big? Sumi asked. Kira coiled around her shoulders like living lightning. Big enough to let through something that could devastate entire cities, Forge said. We will need to seal it from both sides. One team maintaining the barrier while another enters the rift to anchor it from within. Dan felt ice in his stomach. Enters it? What happens to whoever goes in? The dragons exchanged glances, their ancient faces showing something that might have been sorrow. The dimensional boundary is not meant for human passage, Asherah said quietly. Your physical form cannot survive there. Your consciousness might persist for a time, bonded to your dragon, but eventually even that connection would fail. It is a one-way journey. No, Peter said flatly. There has to be another way. There is not. We have discussed this among ourselves. A permanence si le requiert permanent sacrifice. One of us must choose to, I'll go. Dan stepped forward before he could think about it, before fear could override decision. Asherah and I have the strongest bond. We have the best chance of making it work. Done? No. Sumi grabbed his arm. We'll find another solution. There isn't time. He pointed to the horizon where the sky was beginning to tear, a line of nothing appearing in reality. It's starting. Someone has to do this, and it should be me. I'm the one who started all of this. I woke Asherah first. This is my responsibility. Asherah manifested fully beside him, her flames burning low and sad. You do not have to do this. We can attempt the seal without entering the rift. The chances of success are lower, but people will die if we fail. Dan looked at her, at this ancient being who had waited alone in darkness for 3,000 years just for the chance to protect a world that had forgotten her. You told me once the humans are unique because we form bonds that defy logic, because we love things that can't love us back, because we protect and sacrifice with no expectation of reward. I remember. Then let me be human. Let me prove you were right to choose us. The rift tore wider. Wind that tasted of nowhere and nothing began howling across the ocean. The research vessel rocked in sudden waves, and in the distance, the water itself started falling upward into the void. The other bondkeepers began the sealing ritual, their dragons channeling power through the bonds, creating a web of energy around the rift's edges. But it was not enough. The tear was too large, too violent. Something moved in that terrible nothing beyond, something vast and hungry. Dan walked to the railing, feeling Asherah's presence merge more deeply with his own than ever before. Through their bond, he felt her gratitude, her sorrow, her fierce pride in him. Wait, Asherah's voice was strange now, layered with emotion Dan had never heard from her. I need you to understand something. The final truth of why we chose humanity. Asherah, There's no time. There is time for this. Listen, we approach hundreds of species across dozens of dimensions, seeking partners to help seal the rifts. Most refused. Those who accepted did so for power, for knowledge, for what they could gain from us. Do you know what makes humans different? Dan shook his head, watching the rift pulse and tear. You were the only species who cried for us, Ashera said softly. When we explained that sealing the rifts would require sacrifice, that some dragons and some humans would be lost in the process, every other species calculated cost and benefit. But humans wept. You mourned losses that had not even happened yet. You grieved for us, for creatures you had just met, with no logical reason to care. Tears ran down Dan's face now, though he was not sure when they had started. That grief, that compassion, that illogical love for strangers and monsters and things that should not matter to you. That is the power. That is what creates the resonance strong enough to seal dimensions apart. Not your technology, not your violence, not your cleverness. Your heart. Your stupid, beautiful, impossible heart. Understanding crashed over Dan like a wave. You're not asking me to sacrifice myself. You're asking me to grieve, to accept loss while still choosing to act. Yes, the bond itself is the anchor. Your willingness to lose me, to feel that grief, and choose to seal the rift anyway, creates a paradox. Love strong enough to let go. That paradox resonates across dimensional boundaries in a way nothing else can. You don't have to enter the rift, Dan. You just have to be willing to. Dan looked at the rift, at the terrible nothing trying to tear into his world. He thought about everyone who would die if it stayed open. He thought about Ashera, this ancient being who had chosen humanity not because they were strong or smart, but because they were kind enough to cry for dragons they barely knew. He thought about losing her, and the grief was real and sharp and overwhelming. He thought about all the time they would not have, all the rifts they would not seal together, all the conversations they would never finish, and he chose to act anyway. Chose to protect the world despite that grief. Because of that grief, through that grief, the bond between them blazed like a star. Ashera manifested fully, larger than ever before, her flames reaching up to touch the edges of the rift. Through their connection, through Dan's willingness to sacrifice what he loved most, power flowed that shook the ocean itself. The other dragons joined them, their bond keepers adding their own grief, their own willingness to lose everything for the sake of protection. 7 pairs, 7 bonds, 7 impossible loves strong enough to let go. The rift screamed. Dimensional energy fought against them, trying to stay open, try to flood through. But grief is patient. Love is stubborn. Humanity is illogical enough to hope, even when hope seems impossible. The rift sealed. Not with a bang, but with a sigh. Reality knitting itself back together. The terrible nothing fading until only ocean and sky remained. Dan collapsed on the deck, gasping. Ashera remained manifested above him, solid and real. No longer just thought in essence, but truly physical. The other dragons were the same, their forms stabilized by the massive amount of energy released during the sealing. You're still here, Dan whispered. We are still here, Ashera said, and her voice was full of wonder. The paradox resolved differently than expected. Your willingness to sacrifice created the anchor, but your refusal to give up hope, even in the face of certain loss, that reshaped the outcome. You loved me enough to let me go and loved me too much to actually do it. Humans are contradictions made flesh, and apparently, reality itself cannot resist that. The other bond keepers were standing now, marveling at their dragons who were more solid, more real than ever before. The ritual had not weakened the bonds, but strengthened them, made them permanent in a way that had not existed before. What now? Sumi asked. Dan looked around at the group, at these ordinary people who had become guardians, at the dragons who had waited ages to be remembered. The sun was breaking through the clouds, painting the ocean gold. Now we go home, he said. We train more bond keepers. We strengthen the barriers. We protect the world, one rift at a time, for as long as it takes. Humanity will never know, Peter said. They don't need to know. That's not why we do this. Asher settled beside Dan, warm and solid and real. You are right. You protect because you care, not because you expect gratitude. That is the most human thing of all. The research vessel turned toward shore, carrying its impossible crew back to a world that would wake tomorrow never knowing how close it had come to ending. There would be more rifts, more battles, more moments where ordinary people would have to make extraordinary choices, but they would face them together, humans and dragons, partners across millennia, bound by something stronger than magic or power or ancient agreements. Bound by the simple, illogical, beautiful human capacity to love things that should not matter, to protect things that cannot protect themselves, to hope when hoping makes no sense. Dan Rivers returned to his library job on Monday. His coworkers asked if he had enjoyed his vacation. He said it was enlightening and left it at that. At night, he coordinated the growing network of guardians, matching newly discovered artifacts with potential bond keepers, organizing responses to dimensional breaches. The world went on, unaware and safe. And in his quiet apartment, a dragon made of living flame curled around him while he worked, keeping him company in the long hours, grateful beyond words that someone had remembered, that someone had cared enough to listen when she called his name from the darkness. Humanity had been chosen for its heart. And that heart, stubborn and grief-stricken and full of impossible love, would keep choosing to protect, to sacrifice, to hope, for as long as there were rifts to seal and worlds to save.